If you want to know the best way to freeze food without making it taste crappy, stay tuned. Hey, welcome to the spring season of How to Make Dinner. I've got the blinds open and the sun is shining in. We'll see how long that lasts. And we're talking about freezing food today. I'm not much of a freezer meals person. I am, however, quite into freezing individual ingredients or like partially prepped things that will become complete things later on. If you want your food to be at its best, there are certain things you don't want to freeze and certain things you do want to freeze. Putting something in the freezer and having it become less good is just not a viable option for me. I think a lot of people don't realize how long food lasts in the fridge. And if they're not going to eat it like that day or a couple days later, they'll often just revert to the freezer. But I don't really put things in the freezer unless I'm not going to eat them like within that week at some point. So most things are fine in the fridge for like a good 4 or 5 days, even up to a week. I tend to follow a bit of a nextovers kind of protocol. So instead of making a big batch of something and then freezing most of it, I'll make a medium-sized batch of something and I'll eat it one way on Monday and I'll eat it another way on Tuesday and another way on Wednesday. So it always feels like I'm eating something new and it's always fresh and exciting. It doesn't feel like I'm eating the same thing over and over again. So I'll do that with things like chicken soup. This week has been chicken soup. I've had it with rice, I've had it with noodles, I've had it with different hot sauces. I could totally like throw it in with some grains or something and bake it into a casserole if I needed to. It's almost gone now, but you get the point. That being said, there are some things that I really do like to freeze. And when I do freeze food, I like it to be done in such a way where it doesn't degrade the food. So there are a few techniques that you need to follow if you want to optimally freeze food and have it stay top notch. So the first technique is called IQF, which is a restaurant term for individual quick frozen or individually quick frozen or something. All it means is that you want to freeze things individually before you put them all together in a bag or a container. Most people have fallen victim to the thing of putting a bunch of fresh berries into a bag and then freezing the bag, and then you end up with this frozen block of mushed up berries. And sure, you can make jam from it or do whatever, but it's definitely not the optimal way to do it. So the best way to freeze things like berries or any kind of individual item is with the IQF method. So it's easy to do. All you do is get some kind of tray or wide, flat freezing vessel. And then you take your item. In this case, we've got some raspberries. These raspberries are just getting dumped onto this tray. And I want them to be in one layer. They can kind of be touching, but you just want them to be in one layer. Once you've got them all laid out in the tray like this, you just need to pop them in the freezer and freeze them for about an hour until they're nice and frozen hard. And then you can transfer them into whatever container you're using, a bag, a tub, whatever it is. So in they go. If you're freezing things like veggies, say you bought a bunch of beets like this and you really wanted the beets, but you don't have time in your life for these kind of annoying greens, that's a perfect thing to blanch and freeze. So any vegetables that you're freezing, you kind of want to cook them in advance. You don't really want to put raw veggies into the freezer. So things like greens, broccoli, cauliflower, green beans. For these beet greens, because I don't want them to go to waste, I'm just going to chop them off of these beets. This is what I'm going to have for dinner. Just beets. And you can either chop it first or you can chop it after. I'm just going to give it a bit of a rough chop here. And then I'm just going to blanch them in super rapidly boiling salted water for about a minute. After the greens have been cooking for about a minute, you can just run them under some cold water under the tap, squeeze them out really well, and then put them into whatever bag or container you're using to freeze them. So that's a really good way. And then you've got greens for those last minute dinners when you come home and all you have is macaroni and you're like, I can't just eat macaroni for dinner because I'm an adult. And so you cook the macaroni and then you can throw in your frozen greens and maybe a bit of cheese. Then suddenly you've got a bit of a grown-up dinner. If you've ever defrosted an entire turkey and you know it takes about a week, you know that it's a bad idea. So instead, you should freeze things in appropriate sizes. So if you're 2 people, freeze about 2 people worth of chicken breasts or 2 people worth of ground beef or whatever it is you're freezing. That way you can just pull out 1 portion and be done with it. You're gonna thank me later for this one. Cut your bagels or your buns or your bread in open or in slices before you put it in the freezer. That way you can just reach in and grab one and stick it right in the toaster and it's good to go. It's very annoying to pull a whole bagel out of the freezer and then try and figure out how to cut it. By the time you get there, you're not even hungry anymore. Don't put something hot into the freezer. Chill it down first all the way and then put it in the freezer. And by the same token, don't take something out of the freezer and put it directly into the microwave to defrost or into hot water or whatever. It's always better. The flavor and the moisture and the cell structure and everything stays intact much better if it has been defrosted slowly. You can use all kinds of things to freeze. You can use bags. It's best to use freezer bags rather than just like normal sandwich bags. Another thing that I like to use, because, you know, minimizing waste and all, is reusing bags. So these are pretty sturdy. They're like, oh, I've got another one in here. So I've got a raisin bag and an oat bag, which both of these are like, whatever. I don't care if I have ground beef or something and it gets a little bit of raisin sediment on it. It's totally fine. And they're Ziplocs, so it's awesome. So they're pretty sturdy and it's just like one less thing to put in the garbage. So if I'm freezing things like meat, I really like to use bags and I like to roll over the edges because it'll keep the edges clean and then just put it in. This is only if I've bought, you know, way too much meat for some reason. And then the key is to squeeze all the air out. When you're using bags, you want to freeze it flat and squeeze all the air out. So you want to push the food all the way to the corners, and then that's helping to squeeze the air out, and then seal it up. And then it also freezes flat, so it's thinner, and it'll defrost faster, and it's stackable. You can also freeze things in normal containers, Tupperwares. Plastic, if it's cheaper plastic, is not the best because sometimes it cracks, especially if you overfill it. I do tend to freeze things in these glass containers with lids pretty often. It's great, works well, and then it's really easy to defrost because you can just take it out and put it on a plate for condensation and just, it's ready to go. The other thing I sometimes freeze in, which is counter to the stackability point that I just made, is in jars. So I'll often use a jar if it's like chicken stock or something like that. And the key with a jar so that it doesn't crack is to leave enough space for the food to expand. So whatever it is, if it's stock, you want to leave at least like 2 inches in the top so that when it expands, it just fills up and it doesn't explode. So the key factors when choosing your containers, stackability is huge because you want to maximize the space in your freezer. Air minimization is the best way to prevent freezer burn. And defrostability is the ability to defrost your food quickly, evenly, and without too much mess. I would say no to freezing cooked meats unless it's really stewy, kind of saucy meat thing, like say a chili or a bolognese sauce or something like that. So for example, this bolognese sauce that I made today is a perfect candidate for the freezer because I could just freeze it in small little portions, just enough for 2 or 3 people, and then yank them out and cook fresh pasta, and it's a perfect, easy dinner on the fly. I'd also say no to vegetables unless they've been blanched, steamed, or processed beforehand, like I showed you earlier. I will say that vegetable soups tend to get weird no matter what. I really don't like the texture that you get with like frozen carrots and stuff like that. It's just a bit weird. Great things to freeze that you might not have thought of before. Homemade baked goods. So if you make muffins or banana bread or some kind of breakfast cookie or any kind of cookie, get those guys individually wrapped in the freezer or stashed away in a container. And they kind of double as an ice pack. You can pull them out of the freezer just in time for school that day and send them off in your kids' lunch. And they keep the rest of your lunch cold. And then by the time it's lunchtime, they've defrosted and it's just a perfect little harmonious thing. That tip came from my mom because she used to do that with cookies and it was the best thing ever. Another thing to keep frozen, which is so awesome, is cookie dough. So you can either individually scoop cookie dough onto the IQF format like we did earlier, or you can roll it into a log and wrap it up and then freeze it that way, and then it'll be like a freeze and slice method. It is so nice to have cookies on demand, and that just means yanking them out of the freezer and putting them on the baking sheet and you're good. You've got cookies. It's the best. Another one of my favorite things to freeze, I have to go get it. This was a can of tomato paste. It was a really big can, and I opened it and I was like, there's no way I'm gonna use that much tomato paste. So I took the can and I took my trusty portion scoop, which I talk about a lot, and I just scooped the scoops of tomato paste onto a sheet and froze those, and then once they were frozen, I put them in a bag. So these are like perfect little tomato paste portions, and I'm good to go for tomato paste for however long. Another thing I love to freeze is fresh herbs. So fresh dill is such a good one to freeze. I don't often use a whole bunch of dill, so I'll buy a bunch, or I'll even buy 2 bunches, chop the whole thing, and then put a good chunk of it in the freezer in a bag, and then it's just like having fresh dill on demand. This is kaffir lime leaves that I used in the Thai red curry episode with Heidi. Fresh herbs are a great thing to freeze. I love them. I think dill is my favorite so far. I hope this has helped you out with your food freezing. Let me know if you have any questions. I'd love to keep the conversation going down in the comments. And tell me some of your favorite things to freeze. I know some people go crazy with freezer meals. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you next time. We'll be talking about something else.